A young black man named Jamal, a humble and well-behaved teenager living in one of the city's poorer neighborhoods, is walking home after football practice. Life has never been easy for Jamal and his family. They live in an old house barely holding together. His mother, Mrs. Harper, works two jobs to support him and his younger sister, Aaliyah. Jamal dreams of a better future, finishing school, earning a scholarship, and getting into college to become an engineer. Football is his ticket to a brighter future, but to achieve that, he has to study hard and avoid trouble at all costs. One day on his way home from practice, Jamal notices his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Clark. She's known for keeping to herself, rarely speaking to people, especially the young black boys in the neighborhood. Mrs. Clark lives alone. Her children and grandchildren moved to other cities long ago, and now she battles loneliness every day. Today, she's standing on her porch, visibly losing her patience. Her TV remote isn't working, and she's struggling to fix it. Jamal, who has always been raised to help others, decides to offer assistance. "Excuse me, ma'am, is there something wrong with your TV?" he asked politely, a kind smile on his face. At first, Mrs. Clark looks tense. Her eyes scan Jamal suspiciously, as if trying to assess whether he can be trusted. Years of life experiences have filled her with stereotypes and fears, but something inside her tells her that this young man just wants to help. After a moment's hesitation, she reluctantly nods and invites him into her home. Jamal quickly finds the problem. It's just a disconnected cable. He fixes it in a couple of minutes and the TV comes back on. Mrs. Clark thanks him, though her smile remains tight, as if she's battling inner demons, trying to overcome her prejudices. "Thank you, young man. You're a good boy," she says, reaching out to pat his shoulder, but then quickly retracting her hand as if regretting her action. Jamal doesn't think much of it, says goodbye and heads home. To him, this was just another day in his life, but he has no idea that the next day will bring a terrifying turn of events. The next morning starts like any other. Jamal wakes up early to get ready for school. He carefully checks his uniform for practice, preparing for an important match that could be decisive for his future. But instead of heading to school as usual, his life takes a sudden turn when a loud knock shakes the door. Two police officers are standing on the porch. Behind them is Mrs. Clark, clutching her purse with both hands as if it's her lifeline. Jamal's heart sinks. In the old woman's eyes, he sees fear, but that fear is directed at him. "We've received a complaint," one of the officers says coldly, staring at Jamal. "You're being accused of theft." Jamal's world flips upside down in an instant. Theft? He can't believe what he's hearing. He tries to explain that he only helped Mrs. Clark fix her TV, but she cuts him off, her voice trembling with emotion. "After you left, my gold necklace was gone. I just bought it, and now it's missing," she says, afraid to even glance in Jamal's direction. Jamal is stunned. He didn't take her necklace. He's always been a straight-laced kid, doing everything in his power to stay out of trouble, knowing full well that any accusation, especially from a white woman, could spell disaster for him. His mother, Mrs. Harper, steps out of her room, shocked by what's happening. She sees the police officers, hears Mrs. Clark's accusations, and immediately jumps to her son's defense. "My son's no thief. He would never do something like that," she shouts, but her words seem to carry no weight. One of the officers responds coldly, "We're going to search the house. It's standard procedure." The officers begin to search the house, ignoring Mrs. Harper's protests. Jamal stands to the side, his hands shaking, unable to comprehend what's happening. They rummage through every room, turning things upside down. Finally, in Jamal's bedroom, one of the officers smirks as he holds up the necklace they supposedly found under his pillow. "Looks like we found what we were looking for," he says sarcastically, holding the necklace up for Mrs. Clark, who gasps with relief and nods. Jamal can't believe his eyes. How did the necklace get there? He knows he didn't take it. His mother, in tears, begs the officers to stop, but one of them already has handcuffs on Jamal. "You're under arrest for theft," the officer says, and in that moment, Jamal realizes his life may be ruined forever. Jamal is taken to the police station, where he's interrogated as if he were an adult. He tries to explain that he's innocent, that he would never do something like this, but the officers remain indifferent. To them, it's just another case, and it seems the outcome has already been decided. His mother frantically tries to find a lawyer, but in their neighborhood, good lawyers are expensive, and money is something the Harper family doesn't have. Soon Jamal is placed in a jail cell where he sits alone, trying to comprehend how his life has turned into a nightmare in just one day. Meanwhile, rumors start to spread in the neighborhood. Some people sympathize with Jamal, knowing him as a polite and well-mannered boy who always tried to avoid trouble. But others, especially the older generation, start nodding their heads suspiciously, saying, "Well, there's no smoke without fire." These biased opinions only make the situation worse. Jamal feels more and more trapped in a system where the color of his skin and his socioeconomic status matter far more than the truth. Meanwhile, Jamal's best friend Mario, who lives nearby, remembers that there are security cameras installed on their street. Mario, having known Jamal his whole life and never for a second believing in his guilt, decides to investigate the situation himself. He goes to a neighbor with the cameras and asks for the footage. The cameras captured the moment when Jamal entered Mrs. Clark's house and left just a few minutes later. But the footage also shows something else. About an hour after Jamal left, Mrs. Clark's nephew, Tom, arrives at the house. Tom has a reputation in the neighborhood. People often talk about him running with the wrong crowd, and it's no secret that he's a gambling addict, deeply in debt to many locals. Mario, now suspicious, takes the footage to Jamal's lawyer, Mr. Rodriguez, who specializes in defending people against wrongful accusations. Mr. Rodriguez takes the case without hesitation, knowing full well how often cases like Jamal's occur. He's ready to fight, but he understands the challenge of taking on a biased system. In the meantime, Jamal sits in his cell, overwhelmed with despair. With each passing hour, his faith in justice fades. His mind keeps returning to the day he helped Mrs. Clark. He replays every detail in his head, trying to figure out how things could have gone so wrong. His heart fills with bitterness. How could his life be turned upside down just for doing a good deed? In the neighborhood, a social divide begins to form. Some residents support Jamal, knowing him as a decent kid who always stayed out of trouble. But others start spreading rumors, believing nothing happens for no reason. At local shops and on the streets, people are discussing the situation, and many, especially older residents, tend to believe that where there's smoke, there's fire. Jamal not only becomes a victim of a wrongful accusation, but also of societal pressure. Even his teachers, upon hearing about the situation, start looking at him with suspicion. It seems that every time Jamal speaks the truth, his words disappear into the indifferent system that doesn't want to listen to a young black boy from a poor neighborhood. The courtroom becomes the climax of the story. The tension in the air is palpable. Jamal is supported by his mother, friends, and a few neighbors who have known him since childhood. But most of the audience are supporters of Mrs. Clark. She sits in the front row, clutching her purse tightly as if the truth is hidden inside it. Her gaze is cold, and she is clearly prepared to stick to her accusation until the end. Mrs. Clark is the first to testify. She nervously recounts her version of events, repeatedly emphasizing how this young man came into her house, and soon after, her beloved gold necklace was gone. Her voice trembles, and she draws sympathy from many in the courtroom. Her story sounds convincing, and it seems like Jamal has no chance. But when Jamal's lawyer, Mr. Rodriguez, presents the surveillance footage in court, the tension rises. The video clearly shows that Jamal left Mrs. Clark's house empty-handed. However, the most crucial part comes next. The video captures Mrs. Clark's nephew, Tom, arriving at the house shortly after Jamal left. He spends about 10 minutes inside and exits holding something shiny in his hand. This moment sends shockwaves through the courtroom. Mrs. Clark pales. She realizes her nephew may have framed Jamal. Her voice becomes quieter, and she struggles to answer the lawyer's questions. "You, Mrs. Clark?" Mr. Rodriguez asks, looking directly at her. She pauses for a few seconds before barely whispering, "He's my relative. I never thought he was capable of something like this." This admission becomes the turning point in the case. The judge and jury begin to see the gaps in the accusations against Jamal. Soon it's revealed that Tom, deep in debt, used his aunt to get himself out of another financial hole by framing Jamal. Jamal walks out of the courtroom vindicated. But for him, this is not a victory. He knows that the system that so easily accused him will continue to destroy other lives. He experienced firsthand how prejudice, stereotypes, and fear can shatter the future of an innocent person. Even though his name has been cleared, suspicion still lingers in society. Now, at home, Jamal is greeted by friends and neighbors who supported him. But deep inside, he feels a growing sense of disillusionment. He knows that his life will never be the same again. Even after being cleared of all charges, it will be difficult to rebuild people's trust. His reputation is still tarnished by the fact that he was arrested, and many of his peers will continue to treat him with suspicion. Jamal's mother, Mrs. Harper, hugs him, but there's a trace of worry in her eyes. She knows that for her son, as well as for many other black teenagers, this case is just one of the many trials they will have to overcome in their fight for a normal life. The system of injustice remains, and Jamal will have to fight for his place in this world. This story reveals the brutal truth about how easily the system can ruin the life of a young person simply because of their race and social status. Jamal wasn't guilty, but his arrest and the accusations were a direct result of deep-seated societal stereotypes that continue to shape people's opinions. Jamal sitting on his porch, watching the street. His mind is filled with thoughts about how many others like him are wrongfully accused and remain behind bars, unable to prove their innocence. He understands that his exoneration is just the beginning of a long journey toward true justice,